Hello, and welcome back to Something to Noodle on. I'm your host, Mac. I wanted to remind you that Patreon supporters get the podcast a day early, so if you can't wait until Tuesday, you can get it on Monday. All right, that's enough updates. Let's get right into it. There's this current trend in the working world that seems to be all over the headlines these days. It's called quiet quitting. I'm sure you've heard of it, but it's not exactly what it sounds like. It's not about abandoning our jobs without a word or about disappearing into the void without a trace. It's about drawing boundaries with our places of employment and refusing to engage in work tasks outside of working hours. No getting in early, no staying late, no going to meetings that aren't essential. No more giving too much of ourselves for an arrangement that might not even be permanent. And despite what critics and corporations might have you believe, quiet quitting is actually a good thing. But it makes me wonder if we're approaching the important relationships in our lives the same way. We certainly should be, but I know it's all too common for us to give more of ourselves in relationships than is probably beneficial or healthy. Knowing when to let go of relationships, whether personal or professional, is a difficult skill to master. So let's talk about it. Human beings are social by nature. We rely on one another to grow and survive. We all have different talents, skills, and abilities, and by sharing those with one another or by working together toward a common goal, we ensure that each one of us has what we need to make it on this home we call Earth. As they say, no man or woman, or really anyone else for that matter, is an island. But sometimes those relationships stop functioning the way they should, and clinging on to them only causes suffering. We fall out of love, we discover irreconcilable differences, we diverge in the woods as we choose opposing pathways. At our best, we recognize these moments clearly and adjust our lives accordingly. But then again, sometimes we find it harder to let go than we ever thought imaginable. Or maybe for some, it's convenient to keep on going without acknowledging the elephant in the room. Regardless, we need to be able to recognize when we are no longer getting what we need from a relationship, whether that be emotionally, romantically, and everything in between, and then take the necessary steps to make a clean break. Working relationships are probably the easiest type for us to let go. Most of the time, work relationships are built out of necessity or circumstances out of our control. We don't always get to choose who we work with. We're merely brought to the same place because we share similar skill sets and or career goals. Of course, we can form some pretty amazing work relationships though. Coworkers can become friends and bosses can become mentors. Have you heard of the term work husband or work wife? It's when you develop an emotional bond to someone at work. You may even bicker and fight like a married couple. This is your go-to person, a work bestie, if you will. Most of the time, your relationship only consists of time spent at work. In today's world, our early jobs become stepping stones to better opportunities, and it's not impossible to completely switch careers later on in life. Most of us recognize the general transience of the connections we make out in the workforce. We're not trying to find our lifelong ride or die besties or even our soulmates at work. Does that occasionally happen? Of course, but we don't expect it. And when it comes time to move on to the next big thing, unless we are so absolutely passionate about our work and the connections we've made there, most of us are pretty okay with leaving. I've definitely had bosses that I didn't want to let down by turning in my 2 weeks notice. James was probably one of my favorite bosses that I've ever had. Turning in my 2 weeks hurt my soul because I believed in what we were doing and I loved how he led our team. And I didn't want to let him down by leaving the company. Sure, we can always keep in touch with coworkers who have become friends, and in some cases, those friendships actually become stronger without the rules and expectations that come along with the workplace. And as for those coworkers we only interact with because we had to, once we're gone, we never have to talk to them again if we don't want to, which can be a good thing if you're consistently dealing with one-uppers or people whose personalities just don't mesh with yours. Knowing when to leave a work relationship is generally a lot easier to recognize than most of our interpersonal relationships. Beyond the relationships we form with our coworkers, we also have the employee-employer relationship. Knowing when to end that can be a bit trickier. Common situations include not being paid what you're worth, your work environment becoming toxic, or the demands of work becoming more than you can or should be expected to handle. It often comes down to understanding your value as an employee and making sure that others see and respect that value as well. For example, I have a friend who works in education. When she started at her position, she made a decent wage, well above the minimum, and fitting for her experience and education level. But unfortunately, wages have stagnated at her job, and the base rate for her position hasn't gone up in nearly a decade, which, girl, by the way, that's fucked up. But with those similar positions at other companies, they're offering twice what she's making. Again, fucked up. Girl, you should leave. But since her company doesn't have any plans to raise wages, she's considering going on a hunt for a job that will pay her well what she's worth, which you totally should do that, girl. I know you're listening right now. Do that. I think we all can agree. If the place you're working at no longer sees you as a worthwhile investment, then it's time for greener pastures. Just because you have been working with a company for 5, 10, or even 15 years doesn't mean they are loyal to you. We saw this during the pandemic when layoffs were happening left and right. If your company thinks your work can be outsourced for cheaper or isn't essential, then maybe it's time to find a job that makes you feel like $1 million. As a society, we have agreed upon rules in place for ending business relationships in a mutually positive way, and that tends to make it easier to put those plans in motion when the time comes. For example, in the United States, it's customary to give 2 weeks' notice when you know you're leaving your current place for another. Most places want that in writing to make it official, though occasionally you might be in a working environment that is casual enough to accept a verbal notification. If you're in good standing with your company, you can sometimes request a letter of recommendation from your boss. Other places may even have severance pay, though that's typically written into your contract at the beginning of your employment, and occasionally dependent on other circumstances surrounding the end of your employment with the company. If you do everything right, this usually goes off without a hitch, and many companies will welcome you back should your circumstances change in the future. As much fun as it might be to make a big production of quitting and flipping off your boss, that is almost sure to come around and bite you in the ass in the future. Overall, making a good clean break is better. It's how you should end most work relationships. Plus, you never know where someone will be in 10 years. That IT analysis person that you might not really like right now could be your future boss. So try not to screw over the company is usually the best policy. On the other end of the spectrum, romantic relationships are some of the hardest relationships to leave. For every great love song out there, there's a breakup song just waiting around the corner. And the lyrics of heartbreak simply aren't pretty. We sing about how we've had our hearts broken, ripped out, stomped on, and shattered. The loss of love is so real and so raw that oftentimes it feels like we're physically aching. Why go through that if we don't have to? We've invested so much time and effort and emotion into our romantic relationships. Perhaps we share property or maybe even have children or pets together. Splitting up often involves outside parties who were close to both halves of the couple. For many people, marriage is considered the pinnacle of the relationship, the end result of our labors and courtship rituals, and the reward for months or even years of trial and error searching for the one. And that hard work doesn't stop after we walk down the aisle. We still put in our blood, sweat, and tears to make this arrangement work. But even after all of that, sometimes marriages still fail, and no amount of therapy, meditation, or compromise can save it. Eventually, it comes to a point where we have to separate for the good of all those involved. So many times, divorce isn't breaking apart a couple, it's breaking apart a home. If there are kids involved, of course, it's even harder. Kids all too often feel like they're the ones to blame when their parents get divorced, or they're caught in the middle of a custody battle and are juggled between two houses. I know of many cases where parents decided to stay together for the kids, but that too can be just as damaging. And even when couples aren't married, either because they never got to that point or they simply never wanted to, these same family dynamics can come into play, making the choice to break up just as tough as the choice to divorce. As a person whose parents are divorced when I was younger, I'm actually pro-divorce. It's much, much better for children to grow up and see what a healthy marriage or relationship looks like rather than seeing two adults bickering and arguing all the time. Sure, fights happen, but it shouldn't be considered normal behavior. Staying together for the kids is a surefire way to get your kids deep diving into therapy years later, wondering why they have a need to fix their partner all the time. But one thing that's true of all long-term relationships, whether married or not, is that the longer you stay together, the more you've built up together in the natural course of sharing your lives together. And it's hard to walk away from that. Maybe kids are involved, as we've already mentioned, or maybe you have mutual friends who feel as though they need to take sides if you break up with your partner. Even though we might say it's not so, most of us probably have a bestie or two who we'd expect to stick with us and would feel betrayed if they decided they wanted to be friends with our exes instead of us. Though I personally think you can be friends with your ex, or your friends can split time between two people. If my bestie hung out with my ex, I wouldn't care. We're grown adults who can befriend whoever we want, though I understand that not everyone sees it that way. Some of us get close with our partner's families, so ending things with our partner means no more get-togethers with our in-laws or siblings we've now become really close to. Then there's the endless deciding who gets what in terms of finances, housings, belongings, the dog. It's a lot of additional stress and effort on top of all the emotional difficulties you're already going through. Considering all that, it's easy to see why people choose to stay in a tough situation instead of subjecting ourselves to the pain. The amount of emotional investment we have can often make us stay far longer than we should. Finances, property, family members, even kids, those are all external factors we must take into consideration when breaking up. The emotional angle, however, also needs to be addressed. While love may be the main feeling that keeps us together in our romantic relationships, we also come to rely on several other emotions, such as feelings of companionship, trust, safety, and security, for example. It's nice to come home after a long day and spend the remainder of your time in the company of someone who you can really connect with, who makes you feel valid, seen, and heard, and who can seemingly make all your frustrations melt away simply by just being there with you. These are the things that really make us feel worthy as humans, that keep us happy, give us hope, and encourage us to work hard for the next day and beyond. Losing these feelings you've nurtured with another person, I think, is a lot harder to come to terms with than just splitting up possessions or worrying about which friends you get to keep in the breakup. Of course, these feelings are also instrumental in helping us decide when it's time to let go. It's natural for feelings to fade over time. Sometimes the spark that made us feel so alive in the beginning just dims as the new wears off and you fall into everyday routine. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is a reason to break up. Please don't think that. Since surely old flames can be rekindled, and some couples simply find comfort in the ordinary. But when we're no longer feeling valid in our emotions, hopeful for the future, or happy with our lives, then it could be time to re-examine our relationships and make the choice that's best for us, as hard as it might be. I personally have broken off a relationship of 8 years, almost a decade of my life with this person, but I wasn't happy anymore. When communication fell through and I felt like I wasn't being heard anymore, it was time for me to say goodbye. In the moment, it's really hard, but I knew in my heart of hearts it was the right thing to do. It just had to be done. I know it can be easy to say that we'll move on when the time comes, but there are also tons of stories of domestic abuse victims who stay with their partners despite the physical and emotional harm they're suffering. When I was in high school and college, I was in a terribly abusive relationship. He cut me off from my friends and most of my family. It was hard to leave because I felt like there was nowhere to go. The reality is that this just isn't true. But when you're living in that abuse cycle, it feels like there's no other options but to stay. In less severe cases, we might ignore red flags or decide our deal breakers aren't really all that important because love is all about loving imperfect people, right? Well, we all have flaws after all. And then again, sometimes we stay because being in the wrong relationship is still better than being in no relationship at all. Whatever justifications we make up for staying, we need to learn to recognize when we're fooling ourselves so we can remove ourselves from relationships that, in the end, won't bring us the positive emotions and outcomes we all deserve to experience. Just know that life is way too short to be stuck in an unhappy relationship. I'm not saying to run when the clouds roll in, but give yourself more credit. You deserve a partner who puts in just as much work as you do, and you deserve someone who kisses your forehead in the morning. And you also deserve love, just like the main character of any damn romance movie or novel. Somewhere in the middle between giving overbearing bosses the finger and donning boots that were made for walk-in, we have friendships, which may be more difficult to navigate simply because friendships can be so complex. We often use a hierarchy to describe the level of intimacy we have with friends, such as acquaintances, casual friends, best friends, and your ride or dies. At any one time, we could be balancing a handful of friendships, all belonging to various groups or ones you reach for in certain activities. We have the friends we might call on for brunch, but perhaps we hang with a different group when it comes to hobbies, like going to baseball games or playing Dungeons and Dragons. Each of these friends or friend groups are allowed to access certain details of our lives. We trust our besties with our deepest and darkest secrets, but we'll probably keep the conversation lighter with those friends we only see once in a blue moon under specific conditions. All these different variables can make it difficult to predict what will happen in a platonic relationship. Friendships are often the easiest relationships to form, but the hardest ones to know when to walk away from. We generally don't expect much more than like-mindedness and basic trust from our friends, making it easy to form bonds based on everything from how we feel about animals to how we feel about horoscopes. Friendships are also a lot more forgiving when it comes to differences as well. The deal breakers we might have in a romantic relationship aren't necessarily there in a friendship, like our stance on marriage or kids or politics. These things don't really dictate the directions our friendships can take. It's no skin off my back if I don't want kids, but my best friend wants 10 of them. We're much more comfortable overlooking even bigger disagreements. Maybe because we don't require the same degree of commitment to forge friendships as we do to form work or spousal relationships, which we're bound to by legal contracts. This willingness to forgive can also lead us to stay in friendships long after they've run their course. As kids, we often abide by the mantra, best friends forever, without understanding how lofty of a goal that really is. As we grow and learn, we also change, developing our personalities with every new experience that comes our way. Who we are on the playground in kindergarten and who we are when we toss our caps at graduation are not always the same person. Lifelong friendships formed in our youth are wonderful blessings, but sometimes taking best friends forever to heart can be detrimental to our well-being. To put it bluntly, friendships have the capacity to become toxic. We get angry, we say things we don't mean, and we hurt each other. But we also turn around and patch things up quickly, especially with our ride or die besties. The more the cycle repeats, the more damage it does, until it seems like you barely recognize the other person anymore. After 5, 10, or more years of friendship, it seems like a waste to flush away all the good times you had together. But harsh as it may sound, you don't have to continue being friends with someone just because you've been friends with them for a long time. And just because you don't hang out with someone as often doesn't necessarily mean you aren't friends anymore. I've moved from state to state all throughout my 20s, so I have pockets of friends I haven't reached out to in years. But when we chat again, it's like nothing ever changed. If a deep friendship turns into a casual friendship, that's okay too. The idea of breaking up with a friend feels a bit strange and foreign because it's not as familiar to us as moving on from a job or ending a romantic relationship where you're literally telling them, I'm done. But there are still some techniques you can use to ease the process as much as possible. The most important thing you can do when choosing to end a friendship is to tell the other person, ideally as gently as you can. It's a difficult conversation to have, and doing the fadeaways seems like a good choice to avoid the confrontation. But if you truly viewed this person as a friend, then they deserve to know that the friendship is coming to an end. Once the conversation's underway, one technique to ease the process is to start off by talking about all the good times you had with them. Let them know that you've enjoyed your relationship with them and assure them that you find value in the experiences you shared. Then gently explain why you've reached the decision to move on from the friendship. It can be helpful to write something in advance to make sure you hit all the important points. And make sure to own your feelings rather than assigning blame to the other person. It's okay to feel sad, angry, or guilty during this process, but try to maintain peace as you work your way through this. Part of that includes listening to your friend. It's likely that they're going to be hurt or maybe even confused by the situation. Just remember to be firm in your stance. Gentle, but firm. If I'm being honest here, I never personally have ended a friendship. I've had friendships fade over the years and we just kind of stopped talking. I've had friendships end in huge fights where neither of us felt like we needed to apologize, so our momentum stopped dead in its tracks. But just because I don't talk to these people anymore doesn't mean that I don't think about them. I think about my childhood friends pretty often, like on a weekly basis. However, when they moved, we never exchanged information and our friendships just kind of fizzled away. Though I still consider them my friend, even though they might not consider me theirs. But hey, if they didn't tell me that they don't want to be my friend anymore, then in my mind, we still are. Let's get into a conversation that we don't want to have. I don't think this episode would be complete though if we didn't dive into the hardest relationship to let go of. We're talking about family. They say family is thicker than blood, that families are the compass that guide us. But what do we do when the compass doesn't head north anymore? When ideals and values don't align with our own? Do we say goodbye? That answer is a tough one because a line for you might not be where I draw the line with my own family. I have friends that have had some pretty rough upbringings. Abusive parents, homelessness, in and out of the childcare system. For some, this is the reality of their childhood, but because they're family, forgiveness is in the heart. Some of my online friends have shared stories of cutting off their parents because they don't accept them for who they are. Sexual orientation or political views can divide a household. Ultimately, though, it's up to you to draw your line and put up barriers when it's been crossed. This doesn't mean to cut out your family completely, but know when it's time to hang up the phone or visit a little less. In those situations where your heart tells you it's time to say goodbye for good, it's okay to feel your feelings. You might feel guilt or be relieved. Both are completely valid. Family isn't always blood. It's the people in your life that want you in theirs. If it seems like we're just encouraging you to leave at the first sign of trouble, that is not the case. By all means, do whatever it takes to keep your relationships together. There are plenty of resources out there that are designed to help you do just that, like conflict management, couples therapy, or just plain old having a heart to heart. Choosing to end a relationship shouldn't be a decision you make lightly, but it should be the next course of action once all attempts at remediation have failed. And one last thing, it's okay to feel sad when you say goodbye. Severing the connections we have with other people goes against our nature as social human beings. The closer the relationship, the more it's going to hurt when you let go. Take as much time as you need to heal. When it's all over, you'll have a better understanding of yourself and the boundaries you need to set when it comes to work-related, romantic, or even platonic relationships. There is no shame in doing what you need to ensure a healthier, happier you. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I know it got deep, it got hard, but I hope I gave you something to noodle on. Before I go, let me leave you with this. When do you know that it's time to let go in your own relationships? If you want to keep that conversation going, join our Discord or follow us on Twitter at @apodtonoodleon. Until next time, bye!